Ian, welcome to the SALT Community live stream, Facebook Live, whatever words we're calling it these days. What started as an experiment has turned to this. And so thank you for carving some time out and hanging out with us. Obviously, there's some people who know who you are. They met you at conference last year. They've read some of your incredible books, but just maybe give the 30-second how Ian would like to be introduced if you had your own opportunity. I mean, you get introduced probably in so many ways. You're like, I wouldn't have done it that way.
Oh, man. Well, first and foremost, I'm a husband and a father to three incredible children and the most perfect dog known to humankind. I'm a author. I'm an Episcopal priest. I'm a songwriter. I'm a speaker. I'm, a spiritual director. Gosh, what else?
Do you just wake up in the morning and go, what's something I haven't done that is so not connected to the others, and I'm going to check that box over the next year? Or
yeah, it's so funny. For the longest time, I used to have sort of a self-image problem, which was what is it that I actually do for a living? and like what would my business card look like? So actually, one time I called a friend of mine and who had seen me do a lot of work, and I said to her, if I had a business card, what would you put on it? And she was like, oh, that's a great question. And she wrote back to me a quote from the poet Robert Frost that said, I am not a teacher, ellipsis, but an awakener. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, that's a pretty great description, at least of what I aspire to be, which is an awakener. Unfortunately, you can't put awakener on your business card because it's pretty dang presumptuous. But it seemed to me then that at that moment, I also realized that, I also left psychotherapist off of my list, that everything I did, from psychotherapy, spiritual direction, songwriting, writing books, all those different things, they were all in service to the same thing, which was to help people enter into a deeper conversation with the mystery of God in their own lives. And so all of them fed into that same goal, So I guess that's how I would like to, in a perfect world, I'd say, I'm an awakener, or I aspire to be one. And that is to awaken people to the urgent immediacy of God's presence in all things and in all people.
I love that. And I think honestly, Ian, there's not a better sort of person as you to speak into sort of what I think our community strives for, and that is to see the role of beauty and art and creativity in the role of the local church, not just as individuals, which I think is so important, right? I mean, we may talk about that today, but if art and beauty isn't important in your individual life, how are you going to bring that into your organizational life? But I think for us to say that creativity and art, story, film, doesn't just have a communicative role in the church, but it actually has an ability to awaken something for our congregates.
Yeah. I remember one time when I was writing my book, Chasing Francis, it dawned on me, and I use it in one of the sections, that, all art is fundamentally speaking in tongues. So whether or not you're a charismatic or not, the idea is maybe not so obvious, which is to say that there are truths, spiritual truths, that normal human language can't carry the freight of, right? It collapses underneath the weight of the symbol that it's trying to convey. And so when you create a work of art, what you're doing is you're saying, look, regular language has failed me. So now I have to convey that through film, or I have to convey it. Like for example, let me ask you a question. Hopefully some of our folks have seen this film, but in many ways, I learned as much about grace from the film Babette's Feast as I did from the book of Galatians, or at least it illuminated Galatians for me in a whole new way. So, but when you're talking about grace, it's like language starts to fail. it starts to collapse. And so you have to say, okay, I have to express this in a choreographed piece in dance or film or some visual art or some other way. And I say it's speaking in tongues because you're using an alternative language to communicate a great spiritual truth, and you're leaving it up to your audience or your congregation to be the interpreters of that
Well, I
other
think that's
language.
what's so beautiful about art, and you've helped form some of this thought in my mind, Ian, that you may not realize back through the days with Chad Jarnigan and Illuminous, and all those sorts of things. But that art has far more to do with how people receive it than how we present it, and it has this ability for like the Holy Spirit to speak through creativity in a way that we don't control, and so it really becomes this vehicle for people to sort of hear directly in their own ways. And you talk a lot about, I mean, listen, I think this is what's so fun about all the different hats of the different ways you've created awakening for people. I mean, you started as an author. Well, you started as before the priest, you were a songwriter and all that, then kind of stepped into pastoral role. What does it look like to shepherd, liturgical sort of expressions of art and beauty? And I think what is so beautiful is that you've broken in beautiful ways. And we'll maybe talk about this bowl that you talked about at SALT conference this past year, but you've broken the sort of idea that it's not just religion, it has meaning and depth. I'll never forget when you talked about communion and the Eucharist, that Tiger Woods doesn't get up on his tee to warm up right before the Masters because he forgot how to shoot a ball, but so that it's so routine and normal in our fabric. And those are back in the sort of Chasing Francis days, my father and the CIA books you've written, but then you kind of have recently stepped into a whole lot more of this Enneagram stuff. I just want to talk about it just for a second, because it's so much of what you're doing. And people out there may know about The Road Back to You. Fantastic book. Talk about this Enneagram and maybe how the awakening side you've stepped into Enneagram. And I mean, we can talk about all the things you're doing now, tests and all that, but what caused this awakening manifestation to step into Enneagram?
Well, the Enneagram is a ancient personality typing system that teaches there are 9 archetypal personality styles in the world, one of which people gravitate toward and adopt in childhood as a way to make sense of the world, of their experience, to create safety, and also to navigate the world of relationships. And there are an infinite number of expressions of each of those 9 types. So it allows for, the fact that there are 7 billion people on the planet and not all 9 predictably and habitually act in the same way every single day to every circumstance. To me, it's an incredible tool of awakening, because self-knowledge, you remember what Calvin said at the beginning of the Institutes, he said, without knowledge of self, there is no knowledge of God. And that's a very powerful idea. St. Augustine had a prayer where he said, Lord, may I know myself that I may know thee. And so there's this powerful interconnection that the church forgot, I think, post-Reformation, or in some ways early Reformation, that there's a relationship between knowing self and knowing God. And knowing self is not navel gazing. It's not some kind of therapeuticized religious practice. It's a deep knowledge of our need for God and how God might meet us in the broken places of our lives. And quite frankly, people who aren't very self-aware tend to, as we all know, bang guardrail to guardrail through people's lives in ways that are not very skillful or helpful.
Yeah.
And I love it as a tool because actually it's a portalway to a conversation, a more broad conversation about just what does it mean to be human. So sometimes it's just, the Enneagram is just a conversation starter for me. It's just a way of getting into a conversation about what it means to be human. And so that aligns with what I said earlier about my mission in life of trying to help people be in conversation, deeper conversation with the mystery of themselves and God.
And your book does a great job of breaking all of the 9 down and allowing you to find yourself, I think, in that. And hopefully my team can post some of the links to that book, Road Back to You. But you also developed this test, which I think is so good because you've also talked about tests that sometimes tests can't be the most accurate. But I think you and your research and your team was able to really create through is it called the IEQ-9?
Yeah. People can get it on my website, ianmorgancron.com.
So this thing obviously talks about your type, but it also breaks down subtypes. Talk just briefly about subtypes.
Ooh, it's hard to talk briefly about subtypes, but so, really there's 27 numbers. If you want to include wings, we're going to hit up toward 54. I mean, yeah. So every type is a low resolution picture of the interior world of human beings. Each type has a subtype based on its relationship with the survival instincts that all of us have: self-preservation, our social instinct, and our one-to-one or bonding instinct, right? So, one's about personal survival, self-preservation. When we talk about social subtypes, we know that, where you are in the hierarchy of the social chain, right, is part of survival. You don't want to be the impala at the back of the pack that's limping, right?
Right.
So, and then there's one-to-one, which has to do with those special one-to-one, literally reproductive relationships, which is also part of survival, personal survival, because you're passing on genes, right, to the next generation. So, so each of these types, for each of those types, one of those survival instincts is dominant. And so you get three nuanced expressions of that type and a greater distinction and clarity about how you operate in type. So subtypes are terrifically important. You can learn a lot from just knowing your dominant type. You could stay at that level of knowledge and be just fine. But if you wanted deeper knowledge and more clarity about how your type moves through the world, then moving to subtypes is a logical next step.
Well, I think the book helped me narrow down what I felt like as I was reading these descriptions. Hey, this is what I feel like I resonate with and whatever. And I feel like the IEQ-9 pretty much like confirmed it, right? Like it almost was a supplement to it to help you go deeper. And then you can kind of continue exploring. You just did a phenomenal YouTube series on Enneagram and stress that I think everyone should watch, about how, whether it be COVID-19 or the changing environment around us, how do we in different types and different numbers sort of respond to stress? And I think you also beautifully talked through, like, how do you lead people through stress as a leader, right? I mean, somebody listening to this may be a leader going, how do I manage team members with a whole bunch of different numbers?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's I tell people this, leaders, all the time, that one of the worst mistakes a leader can make is to assume that their way of seeing the world is normal. Because that automatically means when they come across somebody who doesn't see the world the way they do, they either think they're crazy or dumb.
Right.
Or irrational, or like whatever. If the Enneagram is true, there are 9 normals.
Right.
And a leader...
Or 54 if you start factoring all this.
Yeah, just start getting down. But if a leader knows and understands different types, they can bake into their calculations, right? Oh, I'm talking to 9 different types. I mean, I'd say this to preachers all the time. You are usually, most preachers, if not all preachers, if they don't understand that their audience, their congregation is filled with 9 different types, they're generally only preaching to their own type. And once you start to realize this is going to land differently, what I'm about to say is going to land differently with a bunch of different people in here. And so if you may not be able to hit everybody as you communicate, but if you can sort of keep in mind, how big a net can I throw?
Yeah.
By keeping in mind that there are lots of normals in the room and they hear things differently. They see the world differently than I do. It's a very powerful tool.
So if we can pivot for a second, because I think that as you and I were talking last week about, your time at SALT conference last year, you gave 2 talks. One was on this whole concept that we've talked about, Enneagram, and how do we, step into sort of leading with Enneagram, understanding these 9 types. But I sort of asked you also last year at conference to step back into more of your sort of chasing Francis concepts. Some stuff you talked about years and years ago about the role of imagination and creativity. Can you just sort of give maybe a little bit of insight into the role that imagination plays, the power of it in either our church environments or even our individual environments, the way it communicates or connects to communication.
Yeah, so maybe just a couple of things. One is people underestimate the influence of imagination on faith. Your faith lives in the sphere of imagination. And so people tend to think, especially in certain traditions, that, oh, no, it actually exists only in my intellect, in my discursive analytical mind. That's where my faith lives, and in my heart, whatever that means. Well, usually when they talk about their heart, maybe that's synonymous with imagination. As we interact with biblical texts, as we listen to sermons, as we see art in the church, as we, go into an ancient cathedral, and you will quickly find out that the early church, particularly when it didn't have technology and when people weren't literate, they couldn't read the Bible. Well, go look at the stained glass windows. Like churches, when you look at a church, the architecture itself is communicating theology. All you have to go to Chartres or Notre Dame before it was, burned down. But when you see a church, you don't realize that it's actually working on you theologically and spiritually, which is why I always get concerned, and I hate to say this, but you could say that there is a theological commentary being expressed when your church meets in Costco. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, what does that building do to people theologically? Fundamentally, we could all say very little. So as artists, we have to work with what we have to make that space sacred space, so that when people walk into it, they're not thinking, oh gosh, I'm walking into Starbucks or Costco. I'm walking into a space that is separate. You're trying to create an environment where people have this sense of, I'm walking into something weird.
Totally.
Like
I think you can, regardless of the space, with the right canvas, you can paint amazing beauty to help reinvigorate that.
Absolutely. And so that's something I think that teams working in the arts need to remember, right? Which is, hey, I need to create a space in which people, and for the longest time in the 80s and 90s, people were like, no, let's make people feel comfortable. Let's put a Starbucks out in the hallway, and let's do this and that. So, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's what people see every day. What we want to do is create an environment in which people walk in and go, who are these people? Like, what are they about? I mean, look at this place. Because what we want them to do is to have an experience to realize that of the kingdom of God, which is different, right? We're creating a sacred space, and I don't want to draw too much of a distinction between, because all space is fundamentally sacred, okay? But where we really awaken them to the fact in obvious ways, this is a different space. There's a great quote, I can even read it from you. It's from Dr. Zhivago, and the author Boris Pasternak describes one of his main characters like this. Lara, who's the character, was not religious. She did not believe in ritual, but sometimes to be able to bear life, she needed the accompaniment of an inner music. She could not always compose such a music for herself. That music was God's word of life, and it was to weep over it that she went to church. And I think what that communicates is this very idea that I'm talking about, right? That space, music, art awakens the imaginations of people that, have been laying dormant, and it's almost like one of the lines from the book I used was that when the front door of the intellect is closed, the back door of the imagination is open. So this is why I always laugh with not at pastors, but I've been a pastor. I've been a preacher too. Okay. So and I've been a worship leader. So I know the difference.
You can speak from both sides.
I definitely can. Most preachers are trying to get in the front door of people's intellects. Now, the problem with that is that your intellect comes outfitted, standard equipment, right? Is critical filters. So if you say, God is love, people's critical thinking can come up with all manner of objections to that idea. But if you come in the back door of their imagination and you communicate the idea that God is love in a different kind of a language, it sneaks up on people, and the way that the parables did, and it sneaks up on people, and may leave the church and 2 days later go, God really is love. Wait a minute,
I get that. Yeah, I feel it.
Get it.
I don't just know it; I feel it. I believe it.
I feel it. So what you've done is you have subversively infected their imagination, and imagination plays a terrifically important role in the life of faith. And of course, the imagination can come up with all kinds of heinous things, but a redeemed imagination can come up with some really crazy, wonderful, influential things.
So let's go back to what you said earlier, and you talked about how our faith is more rooted in imagination than it is intellect. Would you say that it is both? Yeah, but it's probably leans a little bit more to you have to believe it, right? That you would have the faith like a child, as Jesus said, and all this. Would you go as far to say when our faith feels like it's failing us, it's because we're relying too much on intellect or knowledge that maybe has fallen?
Yeah, I think it's very possible that if you intellectualize faith too much, that there's a dryness to it. And this really sort of...
Is that when it becomes religion? And a series of, hey, I just need to sort of plug and play these constructs?
Yeah, or it just becomes a set of propositional truths, or dogma, or something like that. It's just propositions, right? Versus a faith that is more holistic. So, really, this was a revelation to me. So I was doing doctoral work at Fordham University, which is the Catholic university, it's the big Catholic University of New York. And I remember a conversation I had in a class once about the difference between the Protestant and the Catholic imagination. And they're different. We often think, there's huge theological differences between Protestants and Catholics. Nonsense. For the most part, they align. And what the difference between a Protestant imagination and maybe not a Catholic imagination, we can call it a sacramental imagination. Okay, that might be another way of putting it. Is that Protestants' imagination tends to go like this. We live in a fallen world, a broken world. Periodically, God shows up and reminds us, whether it's Jesus or, the prophets or, the canon of the Bible, whatever you want to put in there. And then he disappears again. And then we live in a world that is sort of absent of the presence of God. That's the feel, right?
Or we're in a season of anticipation of the next presence.
Right. Whereas the Catholic or sacramental imagination says, no. We live in a world that is brimming with the presence of God. That God is not far off like a satellite circling the earth who we periodically throw a prayer at and hope he triangulates it toward the person we're praying for. In other words, we are swimming in God. Like when Paul says, we live and move and have our being in God, he's not talking, in my mind, about a theological idea. He's saying literally right now in this moment, we are awash in the presence of God. So every tree, piece of music, these are expressions of this great truth that, like God, we talk about the word anonymous, meaning not knowing the name of something, right? Mm-hmm. But then there's another word, which is hypernym, which is the opposite, which is that God is so present and so, as Augustine said, God is closer to us than we are to ourselves, right? So that means that we're actually blind to God's presence around us because it's so present to us. It's always there. Now
it just becomes normal. Like we don't even sense it or see the differences or the uniquenesses.
Right. So this is where the artist comes in. And what the artist does is awaken people to the reality that God is immediate and present. So when I hear people say, come Holy Spirit, come Holy, I'm always like, come Holy Spirit. He's already here.
We need to be awakened.
Yeah. In other words, your job is not to coerce the Holy Spirit to come and show up in the space. Your job is to wake people up to the fact that he is already here and you have just not seen him,
Yeah.
or you have not been aware of the fact that everything, it points to that far off country. And so, yeah, I mean, to me, when
Okay,
I
so
hear
let
a
me
pastor
push.
say,
I
yeah,
love
go ahead,
this.
push away.
Let me push. So where is the difference, Ian, between using art and imagination and wonder and creativity to awaken creativity or awaken God in the presence of our environments or in our culture or in our daily lives versus manipulating or even manifesting God, maybe in an inauthentic way? How do you divide those two things?
Yes, I would say that there's a difference between art and religious propaganda. And it's very important to delineate the difference. When you start to manipulate people with sentimentalism, let's arouse tears here. Let's really go for it, right? Which is really, to me, in art, sentimentalism is like the crime of all crimes.
Are you
Because
talking about those really cheesy emails we used to get with the like Selah music and?
Yeah, I mean, I just think to myself, it's like when you watch a movie and they're working you, and what great art does is it may evoke a very powerful emotional response, but it earns it. It earns it. That's good art. But art that tries to manipulate it or evoke it, in a way, it's like trying to get a cheap. It's a cheap trick, really. And unfortunately, because lots of Christians who grew up in anti-intellectual sort of Christian traditions, they fall for it and they confuse it. And a lot of times, Christian music is religious propaganda. It's not really great art. It's just religious propaganda. So again, this is a long conversation about the difference, but the difference does exist.
I'm letting you just throw some
two.
grenades in the room for a bit.
Well, that's fine. I'm at home, perfectly safe. No one's coming out to get me in COVID. That's fine.
So there's a difference between religious propaganda and art. Talk about what are maybe some distinctions that people can help understand, like, wow, have we maybe been making religious propaganda and we didn't realize it? Like, are there some key distinctions between those two things?
Well, I think art, when you start out, boy, this is tough in the church context. I think instead of starting at, like my friend Mako Fujimura, the painter, Mako, when he sits down, when he starts a painting, he may have a theme in mind, but when he puts the brush to the canvas, he doesn't know where it's going. You know what I'm saying? It's not like he's saying to himself, okay, this is what I'm going to be doing and this is what it's going to look like. It's like, nope, like it is going to evolve as I interact with the actual medium and my abilities to work with that medium and inspiration. And obviously there are times when we have to make things beautiful because they also have a very concrete mission. Like you got to develop a slide deck to talk about the mission trip to such and such, right? Well, you do have to communicate information, so you do have an agenda, but that doesn't mean that it can't be artful, right?
So you're saying more these two things can live together, like propaganda and art can live together. They just can't.
I think information and art can live together.
Okay,
propaganda is manipulation.
Gotcha.
It's got a whole other agenda.
And so as we learn to communicate, we have to be open with the fact that art is a little bit of a free flow process. I mean, for those who don't know Mako, I mean, he's a little bit more on the abstract side of art. Yeah. And his art, if you ever go watch a video, there's phenomenal documentaries about how he creates. I mean, he's taking paint or metals and throwing them into bowls to get them to reflect on the canvases. And so it is this sort of free flow. I'm just going to kind of let the paint lay where it lays, and it's going to tell the story.
Yeah. So when I was a pastor, one of the things I had somebody on a person in the congregation whose sole job was to pick. I laid out the service for them. I told them what I was preaching on. I told them what the music was going to be, And what I asked him to do, and this person had a master's in art history, I said, I want you to create a slide deck that supports what it is that I'm doing today. And they may use, like, on the back of a, something, a Mako painting as a backdrop, or they may use a painting by, a great medieval painter, and so it would be up there. And it created an environment, a smart environment that was supportive of the message, but didn't try to co-opt the message. It's like sometimes art, one way I know that sometimes art is more propaganda is when they just say what it is that they want to say when they could have done it sideways.
Mm-hmm.
Like most art that's effective comes in at you sideways and you don't know what hits you. Rather than it being kind of an obvious thing, and so
you've talked about this before, but this idea of sideways art, when you watch a great film, you leave imagining or dreaming or catching yourself daydreaming, or when you walk into Walt Disney World, which I don't know when we will walk back into Walt Disney World, but when you do, you catch yourself walking through these lands, getting caught up in the story. And it wasn't that Disney said, start thinking about Pixar movies or start thinking about Adventureland or Frontierland, right?
Yeah. You're suspending disbelief, and you. What better place in the church than to help people suspend disbelief?
Yeah. So talk about the importance of imagination today versus, right before we started, you even said this whole Chasing Francis thing, Luke, in the last 6 months has started kind of taking off a little bit more. And what I love about the way you wrote Chasing Francis, for those who have not heard that book, it's not you using intellect to teach them about this.
Right.
You did it in a novel.
Right.
So talk a little about the importance of imagination today versus intellect today.
Yeah. So I think, since the Enlightenment, which is sort of a funny word since it's hardly been enlightening, we have relied on discursive, analytical ratiocination, right? Rational thinking, thinking that that's where the game is. You know what I mean? That's the field. When in reality, appealing to people's imaginations is equally powerful and at times more powerful. So when you twin an intellectual presentation of gospel or whatever, when you're preaching or something else, but when you twin it with great art, well, it's crazy. It's almost like this is what Emmaus is. What happened at Emmaus? And this is why, by the way, and you'll get pushback on this from different traditions. This is why I say you should have Eucharist at every single Sunday. Why? Well, here we are at Emmaus. They don't recognize Jesus at all, right? And then Jesus starts talking to them from the Bible, right? And they still don't get it.
In fact, he gives the entire history, right?
He tells the whole story, and they're like, well, still, who is this guy, And then there's the breaking of the bread, and at the breaking of the bread is the aha moment. The Eucharist is one of the most powerful. It's like one of these experiences that has plumbless meaning. It has no bottom. It's not like you're ever going to get to the bottom of what it says, And so, if you just have the gospel told, and without an imaginative, right, one should illuminate the other.
Yeah.
Right. That's what happened at Emmaus. And that's also why I'm always telling people, get them to the table. Don't overprivilege the sermon. Don't understand that in the flow of a service, if this is the arc and we hit the top is the sermon, right, where everything leads up to that moment, it should have a double arc. So that the next thing would be the table, the altar. And they actually, one is as important as the other. People will say to me, no, the Bible, and I'm like, okay, whatever, if that's your thing, that's your thing. But in my mind, the rhythm or the arc of a service should have two crescendos. And the Eucharist, communion, Lord's Supper, whatever your particular tradition's way of describing it does, is it communicates a truth about God wanting to literally be so close to you that, like food, like bread, it gets down to the cellular level, the molecular level, right? And the Eucharist says things that a sermon can't say. It just can't. Even if you tried, it can't. And I think that's why, and it's a highly imaginative, suggestive thing, right? It's I mean, just think about all the things that happen at Eucharist. People have to stand up and they have to walk down an aisle. Hopefully, I don't like the passing of the bread in aisles, but that's a personal thing. But that's a very powerful, it's actually a powerful political moment. It's a moment where you stand up and come forward. And in the very walking, what you're saying is, my principal citizenship is in the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And I'm walking forward and I have to kneel. Like in my tradition, you have to kneel. Where else do you kneel in a given week? Where else do you have to get on your knees in front of other people, not just in your house, but in front of other people in a posture of need? And then you have to go like this, where you're actually saying to somebody, I'm empty. And this is the posture I should have toward life. And so, as you were mentioning Tiger Woods earlier, that's muscle memory.
Yeah.
If you can eventually do this enough every week, where you're saying,
Lord, provide. Yeah, you've talked about this before. And Ian, I'll never forget when you said this right here is the action of the garden. It's the action of sin. It's the action of I want, I can take when I have. And I know for me, that radically shifted how I think about communion, right? That I wouldn't pull from the bread, but that I would sit like this and it gets provided to you. It doesn't necessarily put the pastor as king or God, but it's just this idea of anyone is providing for you. And it's really supposed to symbolize that.
Right. And if you do this enough, hopefully the external posture will find its way into your interior world, where you approach all of life like this. Like, so you think about this moment where we're facing COVID. I mean, this is the only way we can approach it. I mean, it's like, oh, guess what?
This doesn't work right now.
This doesn't work. Like, guess what? This is how life is. We are not in control. One of the things that COVID has proven, or maybe awakened people to, is this idea that, I thought I was more in control of life than I actually am. That's what causes so much anxiety for people. But if you have this posture,
is the realization that you've lost control.
Well, no, you never had it.
Yeah, but anxiety is this thought of, oh, I've lost control. I don't have all this together. Yeah.
Right. And so when you have this interior posture, it's like, well, Lord, your will be done. Whatever it is you're doing, just help me to see how you want me to participate in the moment of not having control. Like, what is a great question for people right now would be, what is God's will for my life in this situation over which I have no control?
Love that. Say that one more time.
Okay, let me see. What is God's will for my life in this situation over which I have no control? It's a great, it's like, what does this situation make possible that was not possible before it began?
Yeah.
And
you're
awakening me, and that requires imagination.
Yeah. And you're awakening me right now to even think through this whole idea of imagination versus intellect, that communion is not just the practice of taking the bread and the wine. That's intellect, right? Like, okay, God is the bread and he broke himself for us, but that's intellect. And when you pass a cup or when you pass a plate or whatever the hell's all these elements, that's just us engaging in the intellectual side of communion. But what you're asking people to walk into intentionally is, I want them to imagine themselves at the table with Christ and being provided for and kneeling before his throne and walking. Receiving the invitation and saying, okay, I know you said this before, but I want you to get up. I want there to have to be action here. Like, you have to take a step and God will come the rest. But you can't just sit in your chair and he just passed by you, or else we'll miss it. Yeah,
because every single act is loaded with meaning.
Yeah.
And you may not know what that meaning is, but that doesn't mean the meaning isn't working on you.
I love it.
You remember the Kintsugi bowl that I used?
Yes. So tell them, because
conference.
Let me also say this. You didn't just tell Chasing Francis in a creative, imaginative way. When you did this talk at SALT, you did this whole thing. You started with this whole shalom chant. And I think people in the room, I know for me, I was sitting there going, what are we doing? Like, and I've actually seen you do it before, and I still had the thought of, I'm so confused. Where are we? But you brought it back towards the end with this beautiful picture of the Kintsugi bowl, which Mako, which we've mentioned, gave to you. Tell that story a little bit.
Can I just say something about that Shalom chant? First of all, I'm glad when people say to me, where are we going? What's he asking us to do here? This is really bizarre. Well, think about music for a moment, right? We weren't able that day to really go into this, but do you understand how thick with theology that moment was? Like, the very fact that there was nowhere in that space that could resist the sound, which is moving at about 700 and some odd miles an hour, of those multiple voices. Think about the theology of community, multiple voices, every single one different, adding to this chorus of singing shalom into the world and into each other's lives. Think about the fact that sound is invisible, but you can sense its presence. Who does that sound like? It sounds like God.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so think about what sound does. I mean, you know, your ear is the only sense that doesn't have a flap. Like, you can't shut that out.
You also were not giving us propaganda, because you were not having us say creativity is king. You know, like
right.
I mean, so, we were letting the Holy Spirit speak through in those moments.
Yes, and so chords were being formed that will never be repeated. And I've seen that move people I've done that with like 10,000 people, and you ought to hear it, man. It's really something else. And so there's a moment where you're coming in the back door of people's imaginations. It's like, no, let's not talk about it. Let's actually do it. You know? So, but anyway, at Eucharist, when I serve, I often use I use a kintsugi bowl. Now, kintsugi was, it literally means in Japanese, golden joinery. And very briefly, the story is that a Japanese leader, not an emperor, but like a shogun, right? Was he broke his favorite tea bowl. And it's very important for people to realize that in Japan, tea bowls are not like a teacup you go buy at Target. They're passed down from generation to generation, and they have tremendous value to families. So you may be drinking from the teacup of your great-great-great-grandfather. Right?
And that culture has high honor for family. So if you break it, that's dishonoring family.
Right. So he accidentally dropped it and broke it. He's heartbroken, right? So he sends it to be mended, and it gets sent back with these ugly staples holding it together. And he's like, nah, it doesn't work. So a bunch of Japanese craftsmen said, well, give it to us and let us see what we can do. And what they did is they put the shards of the broken piece together, and they mended the broken pieces with gold lacquer. Okay, so it's gold. And when he saw it, he had this revelation that suddenly the broken bowl was more beautiful than the bowl was when it was whole. So I'm always telling people that is the gospel.
Yes.
Now, that's great art.
And you said that speaks more than Paul has written in the entire New Testament combined.
Well, I mean, I don't want to, careful, but it is a visual illustration of an invisible truth.
Yeah.
So when I see this, what I think of is, that there's a great quote. I can't remember. It's not Eugene O'Neill, but it's it doesn't matter now. A great writer who said, "Man is born broken. He needs mending. Grace is the glue." So that's what this is.
Yeah.
So as a piece of art, what this is doing is communicating you can become more beautiful as something broken than you were when you were whole. It's a terrible, wonderful paradox that language can't really communicate in an adequate way. And not only that, but people put their kintsugi bowls out in the open so that people can admire the broken pieces.
I love it.
I mean, what a tremendous metaphor for sanctification, for how God is in the business of transforming human lives. So I actually serve communion out of this.
I love it.
Right? So that whether people understand what kintsugi is or not, they can look at it and it will work on them without their knowing it. I mean, great art does that all the time.
I love that. And I think that's, first off, that's a great place to sort of, come to a little bit of a close on our conversation. But I think it's also a great place to go back to where we started. And that is, maybe for some, it takes a little bit of self-discovery and self-knowledge to really understand where are some of those broken pieces that need that mending from grace, or where are the pieces that, as we get our own self-knowledge, whether it's through the Enneagram or whatever, as we begin to explore our own selves, how we can tap into that imaginative spirit to help show those pictures of grace in ways that words fail, or ways that words can get closed off, as you say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think people working in the arts and church need to take seriously, go to museums, read books on great art, go on YouTube and watch Jeremy Begbie, Begbie, who teaches theology through the arts at Duke. Immerse yourself in learning your craft, because what we don't need is just slide deck producers. What we don't need is just a 4-song worship set followed by an announcement from the freaking youth pastor that he's going to shave his head to earn, raise money for an upcoming missions trip. People deserve more.
Yeah,
they deserve more. Walk around cathedrals, immerse yourself in environments where art is speaking powerfully.
I love that. And
even though use it.
Even though we still have certain stay in place ordinances in many of the cities of the people listening and engaging with us, I still think there's something you're encouraging people, Ian, that I want the SALT community to hear. And that is, your pastor may not fully get this whole backdoor of intellect or backdoor of imagination, front door of intellect thing, but this could be a great time to refine and work on your craft so that that trust level is increased when they start seeing, oh, wow, like maybe there is a kintsugi bowl in our church's story that could come to fruition. And as you work out your craft and trust it, and Mako has said this, and I'll say 2 things Mako said that's really spoken to me. Number one is, he said, art and the gospel aren't that different, because if he had never exposed the wonder or beauty of art, he never would have understood it. And the same is true with the gospel. If you never were willing to accept that invitation to explore the beauty and wonder of the gospel, you never would have been transformed by it.
Right.
But
so
he also,
oh, go ahead. Keep going. No, go ahead.
Well, his second point that I think is really what I was trying to make here is this idea that if they aren't that dissimilar, he then always backs that up with, so create for yourself. Don't always let your creativity be around a mission or a message or a statement that has to be made. Is there art for the pure sake of beauty and wonder so that you can be invited into that imaginative spirit that God has given you, not just for you to leverage your creative craft to sort of communicate a message, which I think is what causes us maybe to fall into propaganda, is that we don't know how to create for beauty.
Yes. And trust, sometimes people create bad art because they don't trust their audience. You know what I'm saying? Like, let's just make this so obvious no one misses it.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? And it's like, no, create something beautiful that in your mind really speaks in your heart, and give it away to people, and just trust your audience. I've learned that writing books, like, don't treat people like they're stupid. Like, because here's the deal. And I remember learning this as early on as a writer. Your audience is smarter than you are. Really. If they really are smarter than you are. If you write an ending to some Christian book that ties up all the little bows and ribbons and everything works out okay, right? Then what you're basically doing, you're lying, number one, because rarely does life end on a little bow and everything works out.
You're showing me the Instagram version of you.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, precisely. Anybody who's got a child who's an addict in the audience, or has had a child die of leukemia, knows that that's not how life works.
Yeah.
And if you continue to paint this kind of like prettified version of the gospel, you're doing a great disservice to people. And to your point about pastors working with arts people in the church, it's difficult because a lot of times pastors have been taught that that discursive analytical approach to preaching is what is going to best, like my exegesis of this text is what's really going to move people. Well, let me just say this, that the best preachers you and I know are storytellers. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, they're already digging into art, as long as they're not using stories that are kind of sentimental and make people cry.
Right.
You know, the football player and the kid who catched it who's blind, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's like people who tell great stories and people who can use art in a way. I mean, I wish pastors could understand that this art will actually, like a flashlight, illuminate what it is that you're saying. So work together with your arts people. Like, don't be an idiot. Like, understand that what you can do can only go so far.
I love it.
And what the art can do is adrenalize the message, right? So to me, the artist in the church functions, okay, I'm going to say it, oftentimes to me, should be considered co-preachers. It's just a different language.
Yeah.
And if you
well,
put
and this
together,
may be that time. I think COVID has caused a lot of pastors to understand the importance of their communications team, their technical team. So maybe this is the moment where, because of your skill of getting a message to an online audience, maybe now you have an opportunity to engage in that creative conversation now that the playing field has sort of been elevated a little bit. Who knows?
Just go online and go get it on YouTube. Go find yourself a beautiful video on, Mako may even have one on his site right now, about kintsugi. Let's say, here's an example. And send it out with a 10-sentence explanation of what this is, and send it out as a communication during the week. I mean, there's all kinds of ways. Or here's a painting that was done by so-and-so. Notice this thing that's going on in here. And how does that relate to our spiritual lives? Now, that requires more work from a pastor because they have to become familiar with the arts. Well,
right.
Guess what? You know, nobody said it was going to be easy.
Yeah.
You know,
I love it. Okay, so if you're listening and you're like, who is this Mako guy? His name is Makoto Fujimori. Most people call him Mako. Lucky his name is different enough that if you Google it, it's probably just going to pop up.
Yeah, Mako, Fujimura.
And if people want to engage, I think the book we've talked probably most about of your material is this Chasing Francis. And it's, like we said, it's a novel. So Chasing Francis, you can go to Amazon to get that, as well as we talked about Enneagram, Road Back to You. But I want to say two things that I would encourage people to check out. We mentioned the test, the IEQ 9 test, but you also did a great series with Donald Miller, Story Brand, guy who has written a ton of novels and well, not novels, but memoirs himself. And so the whole Enneagram Made Simple with Donald Miller, I think that's a phenomenal piece.
Yeah, it's a great resource. It's a great resource for groups. Okay. Because you can learn enough about the Enneagram. Teams, even small groups in a church can watch it together and get a really good introduction to the Enneagram. Yeah, I think it's it's about 5 hours. So it's not a short.
And they can get that at ianmorgancron.com.
Yeah, actually, if they just go to my website, they could buy the Enneagram Made Simple. They could buy the IEQ 9. They could, learn about typology, my podcast.
You got a great podcast. And you've just started doing some video series that have been on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
As well as Instagram and other places.
Yeah, I'd encourage people to sign up for that channel. You just go to Ian Cron. We just today are dropping a series on the Enneagram and parenting. So that'll be 9 days, every day, one type a day. They're like 5-minute videos just talking about how different types of people will parent differently and what are the challenges and the strengths and some transformational tips to help them sharpen their game,
Yeah.
So this is a great time. This is a great opportunity right now to work on self-knowledge.
I love it. And if you're curious about the talk he gave at SALT, either one of them, those are available at the saltuniversity.com site of ours. But Ian, thank you, my friend. This has been fun. And I love that we've actually been able to sort of take what you were worried on at SALT conference last year, saying, and I don't know if we're going to be able to go deep enough. I feel like we just kind of gave them the like epilogue of,
Great.
Your
keynote, really fun
so.
Conversation.
I love it. Well, I appreciate you and appreciate your time. So connect with him, ianmorgancron.com, and hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Cheers, my friend. Thanks, Luke.